All righty. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to the News 6 YouTube channel and the News 6 Plus app. Digital meteorologist David Nazario back in the Digital Weather Center, as you can see behind me. And today we have a treat for you all, folks. So thank you so much for taking some time out of your Tuesday morning to join us. It is a little earlier. I know we usually do our morning weather updates around 11:30, but I wanted to make sure to hash out as much time as possible to talk some big picture science and tropical meteorology this morning. So with that being said, today we are joined by none other than the man himself, somebody I've looked up to for actually a number of years now, especially since I started to dabble in all things tropics. You all know I'm pretty much synonymous with the hurricane season already here at News 6, but we have Dr. Phil Klotzbach of Colorado State University, a meteorologist and a hurricane research scientist specializing in our Atlantic Basin preseason forecasts. CSU has been spearheading our Atlantic Basin preseason and intra-seasonal forecasts since back in 1984 up to date. So a lot of information in store for you all today. We're going to try to do our best to compartmentalize it into this brief conversation between the two of us. So as I always say, everyone strap in and hold on to your butts. Dr. Klotzbach, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing very well, David. How are you? It's cold and snowy here in Colorado, so wouldn't mind being in Orlando right now.
I can imagine. In fact, honestly, I don't know if this is a chance where I would want to say I'd trade places with you. Not digging how hot it's getting out here already, but I'm not quite sure if I'd want to go dabble in some snow and 8-degree temps, you know?
Yeah, it's a little brisk today, but it's a Colorado roller coaster. We'll be up to 50 by Friday, so it's never a dull moment in the Colorado weather department.
I believe that. Back in the Air Force, I actually used to forecast a lot for the Front Range of Colorado, so I know how dynamic, to say the least, that setup can be.
Yeah, I grew up in Massachusetts, and I thought, oh, forecasting in Massachusetts weather is hard. And then I came and moved to the mountains, and was like, it's got nothing on that. Mountainous terrain makes for some fun forecasting challenges, and you're going to have some really big forecast busts on occasion. You can ask my wife about one or two times we've been up in the mountains, and my forecasts have not panned out the way I thought.
I feel that 100%, trust me. And they say a bunch of my flight leadership back in the day, too, when we started training to forecast for all areas in the Rockies, they say if you can forecast in mountainous terrain, you can forecast pretty much anywhere.
I would agree. My forecast still needs some work out here. I think forecasting the weather will always keep you humble, and especially forecasting mountain weather will really keep you humble.
Amen. Amen. Exactly. So with that being said, let's get started. Let's let the viewers get to know you a little bit, sir. So where did all this start? I read a little bit on your background, but why don't you tell us in your own words how tropics and meteorology and all that came to be?
Yeah, so I grew up in Massachusetts, right along the water in Plymouth. And so growing up, I was always obsessed with the weather. I don't remember a time when I was not. And when growing up, we had a couple of hurricanes go through. So Hurricane Gloria made landfall in Connecticut, but brought some impacts to us. And then Hurricane Bob made landfall in Rhode Island, about pretty significant impacts, lots of trees down,
Oh,
power
wow.
outage for a while. So that kind of was what got me really fired up about studying the tropics and trying to figure out basically what makes hurricanes tick. So I did my undergraduate in Massachusetts, and then I applied to graduate school. And Dr. Bill Gray, who was the pioneer of seasonal hurricane predictions, he asked me if I would be interested in coming out to Colorado State, and I always wanted to study under him, and I always have loved the mountains, and so that was a 100% yes on my part, and went out there, and I had the great pleasure to be able to work with him very closely for almost 16 years before he passed in 2016.
Oh, wow, that's right. It was 2016. That was actually going to be one of my follow-ups is why Colorado State, but I would assume it was just the overall environment and Dr. Gray who essentially reeled you in. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. So when I did my undergraduate, I actually did my thesis on seasonal hurricane prediction. So
Oh,
I read a lot of his research ahead of time, and I applied to CSU thinking, well, maybe I'll get it, maybe I won't. And when he called me up and asked me to come out, I was very, very excited.
that's awesome. I can only imagine. That's kind of how it felt getting an email back from you, to tell you the truth. I was like, oh, snap. I got to message my friend Jonathan about this. We're so back. So this is very exciting. It's awesome that there's like a little bit of a tracing the timeline there, if you will.
Oh yeah,
So
yeah. No, it's great. Thank you so much for having me on. And yeah, it was really quite a pleasure to work with Dr. Gray for so many years since he had studied hurricanes, so he got his start in the Air Force, forecasting Air Force weather out in the
oh, okay.
Azores.
Wow.
You have that connection in common. And then
Yeah.
so He came out, so he came from the University of Chicago. And so Herbert Real, who was his mentor, started CSU's Department of Atmospheric Science around in the early 1960s. And Dr. Gray was finishing off his PhD at the time. And so Herbert Real asked him to come out shortly thereafter to become a professor in the department. And so CSU, while obviously very far removed from hurricanes, has always had somewhat of a hurricane focus. Our department does a ton of other stuff besides hurricanes, but one of the areas that our department has had a lot of research focus on since its inception has been on hurricanes and trying to understand basically what makes hurricanes tick.
Okay, very good. Very good. So, just a shot in the dark here. Do you all ever do any site visits or go to like landfall sites, do any reconnaissance collaboration with the hurricane hunters to get more of that data in?
So Dr. Gray flew on a ton of hurricane hunter flights. So
Hmm.
he was on a lot of them. I'm on the waiting list to get on one. I would love to get on one of those flights. When it comes to like after the storm, I have been down after storms to see some of the damage, but not usually like right away
Hmm.
because I'm not, I'm not in that line of work. But I certainly
Yeah.
have gone down and seen some of the damage. Shortly thereafter, I've been in west coast of Florida several times since Helene and Milton.
Helene and Milton, very synonymous names out here in Central Florida. All you watching right now, I can imagine you hear Helene and Milton and the bells are going off and whatnot. And then, so with Dr. Gray, it's very unfortunate we don't have the opportunity to add him into the call here, given circumstance. But how was it working alongside him when building the preseason forecast? Does he still have any rules of thumb that you guys stick near and dear with nowadays?
Oh yeah, so I mean, so if you look at so he started the seasonal predictions back in the early 1980s. So prior to when he started doing seasonal forecasts, basically there was no way to know how active or inactive the season was going to be. And so Dr.
Hmm.
Gray was teaching tropical meteorology in the early 1980s, and he was basically Wikipedia before there was Wikipedia. He knew which years were busy hurricane seasons. He knew which years were El Nino years, and he said, hey, when we have busy hurricane seasons, we don't tend to have El Nino. And so that kind of got him scratching his head. El Nino is warmer than normal water in the central and eastern tropical Pacific. And he was like, well, why would something going on in the Pacific Ocean impact hurricanes in the Atlantic Ocean thousands of miles away? And it was
Hmm.
basically through what's called teleconnection. So basically, when you change water temperatures one place, it'll change basically where the air goes up, where the air goes down. And so what it does in the case of El Nino is it really increases vertical wind shear, which is a change in wind speed and direction with height in the atmosphere. Too
Hmm.
much shear tears apart hurricanes. And so in the case of El Nino, you tend to get more shear, which disrupts the hurricane seasons and tends to lead to overall less hurricane activity. So that's one of his original predictors that he used, and we still use, and most other groups doing seasonal forecasting also still use to this day. So when it comes to kind of what we do now compared with what Dr. Gray did at the start,
Hmm.
some of what we do is very, very similar, but we have a lot more data than he did. So when Dr. Gray was starting this in the early 1980s, he would basically be like calling up people and asking them to basically mail him data from individual
Oh,
weather
wow.
stations. Now we have globally gridded products which allow us to be able to go back and take all the data that we had at the time. So whether it be from satellites, whether it be from buoys, whether it be from ships, whether it be from observations on land, take
Yeah.
all of that and then basically use a weather model to kind of fill in the gaps where we didn't have observations to give us a nice global view of how the circulation looked. And so that is something we have now that we just didn't have back in the early 1980s, and I think has really helped us hopefully improve the forecast skill. Another thing that we do now that Dr. Gray did not have available to him in the early 1980s was we use
Hmm.
climate models. And so a lot of times when people hear climate models, they think projections of what the climate's going to look like 50 years from now. And in this case, what we're looking at is forecasts for the next 3 to 6 months. And we're not looking at, okay, today's February 11th, what's the forecast for March 16th? What we're looking at is a
Right.
1 to 3 month average over a large area. And these models do show reasonably good levels of skill on that. So these forecast models that are built to forecast climate a few months in advance, they were developed on past data. So we can kind of go back and look and see how well they've worked at forecasting in the past. And so that gives us some help too. We have models that will forecast things like El Nino. Now, they're certainly not perfect, but it can give us a clue as to what's going to happen there. They'll forecast Atlantic water temperatures, vertical wind shear patterns, all of these things that we look at to come up with our seasonal forecasts.
Very good. Okay. That actually leads me right into my next question because I'd watched a lot of your interviews prior to just to do a little background research of my own and try to give you some heavy hitter questions so it's worth your time. And I was curious when you mentioned the dynamical and the statistical models, are they internal to you all at CSU, or do you also use a handful of, say, the European Seasonal Outlook, the UK Met Office, the JMA? I believe there's like a C3 model as well, a big Copernicus model outlook or a database that they have out there as well?
Yeah, so when it comes, so what we have is we have two sets of models. One is statistical models, which is purely just based on, okay, so we put out a forecast June 1st. We're
Hmm.
basically using just data up to June 1st. So what were conditions like, say, in April and May, and then assuming basically we look for what we call precursor signals. So historically, what have April and May's look like prior to busy seasons? What have April's and May's look like prior to quiet seasons? And
Oh,
then
okay.
find those predictors, select those predictors. So that is basically just using purely history.
Hmm.
Now, our statistical dynamical models use basically forecasts of the large scale environment during the season. So we focus on August and September, water temperatures, pressures, winds. And so right now we're using four different sets of models. So we use the European Center model, we use the UK Met Office model, the Japan Meteorological Agency model, and then we also use a model out of Italy. Now, these dynamical model forecasts often are very, very similar. So there's not necessarily a ton of new information with each individual model,
Hmm.
but it does give us some additional useful information by incorporating additional forecasts. And one thing that we're going to be doing this year that we haven't done in the past is historically we've used basically the ensemble average. So when these climate models run, they'll run say 50 members or 100 different members, and so that kind of gives you an idea of the spread of
Hmm.
what the models are forecasting. So we're hoping that will help better encapsulate some of the uncertainty. We have various ways of calculating uncertainty with our seasonal forecasts, but using some of these ensemble outputs may help even kind of help us get a little better idea as to helping quantify more of the uncertainty. And as you would expect, if we look at the model forecast from April 1st, there's going to be a lot more spread for what the model thinks is going to happen in general from an April outlook for August or September, as opposed to say like a July outlook for August or
Right.
September, just because you're closer to the events you're trying to predict. And so one thing that we do with our seasonal forecast is while when you hear the forecast, we may say, okay, we're predicting 10 hurricanes. That's our best estimate, but there is uncertainty in that estimate. So we do provide in our forecast kind of error bars associated historically with the forecast. And so those error bars will be pretty wide in April, and then they'll shrink in June and with our updates in early July and early August. The reason why we do one number in the forecast itself is because if you provide a range, often we find the media will basically say up to the high end of the range, which is fine, but then people see that and they assume that's what you're forecasting as opposed to the actual midpoint of the forecast. So at least, it's kind of like when you do a weather forecast, right? You say the high is going to be 78. If the high is 77 or 79, people probably don't really care all that much, close enough. But, if you say the high is 78 and the high is 62 or 91, then, people may start calling up and complaining. So I think we probably also have a little more forgiveness for a wider forecast temperature error in Colorado than say in Florida, where our variations in temperature can be quite dramatic. A couple of days. So last week there was basically a cold front that was coming in from the northeast, and it was 70 degrees at my house, and 10 miles away it was 40.
Oh,
So
wow. What
yeah,
a
yeah. So
difference.
so you're staring down that barrel. We're going out on a run, and it's like, well, it's 70 now, but you probably want to bring an extra layer because maybe when we're done, it'll be 70 still, or it might be 40. So you
That
just
is
don't know.
wild. Just imagine that,
Yeah.
everybody out there watching. You don't get that here in Florida because we're just flat. We're pretty much at sea level. But mountains, any kind of terrain, which is something you'll hear Jonathan and I mention when we do our just weather briefings, especially for folks in the Rockies or up against the lee or the windward side of the Appalachians with these winter storms, dramatic differences in the influence you see on either side or even at the top of those mountains. And so, Phil, do you mind if I call you Phil, sir?
That's totally fine. Yes,
Okay,
yes. I'm not a
perfect.
very formal guy.
Copy that. All righty. Just wanted to double check. So, when you mentioned that you went off of the general average of the ensemble, now you're going to be using pretty much the entirety of the ensemble suite. Will that reflect in the graphics for, say, this upcoming hurricane season? Will you all show the spread for us to kind of digest and then communicate to our viewers?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So historically, what we've done is kind of calculate. We've used some statistical methods to calculate what the ensemble uncertainty would be, but now we can actually just use the straight up ensemble numbers themselves. And I think for this first year, we're probably just going to focus on the European Center because they have the longest hindcast. So most of these models have like a 25 to 30 year hindcast. The European Center actually now is over 40. So
Oh,
that gives us
wow.
gives us more data to better quantify the uncertainty. When you have a few years, it's just hard to quantify the uncertainty and even quantify kind of the ensemble average. Basically, it's harder to quantify, get a good statistical model off of 25 years of data. It's a lot easier over 40 to 50 years just because you have more realizations of how the atmosphere ocean work, and it just kind of helps constrain the model a little bit.
That makes a lot of sense. In fact, I remember during an interview, or I should say just a conversation with your friend Mark Sudduth,
Oh, yes,
he
yes.
had mentioned the same thing, that a lot of folks will bring up, it's in historical average, the record of this, record of that. And we have to remember that the earth, weather, the atmosphere, etc., has been around for centuries, if not millennia. And so when we talk 20, 30, 40 years of data for everyone out there watching right now, there's only so much you can do with that phenomena. It sounds like a lot. It's probably a lot more for some of our lifetimes, but at the end of the day, when you think back to when, we'll say, hypothetically speaking, a hurricane first formed, we probably barely scratched the surface of how much history and data we can compile for that, which is just incredible to think about when you really sit and stew on it. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I mean and so one of the things that we're always kind of battling with the seasonal forecast is obviously we'd love to build a forecast model on as many years as we can,
Hmm.
but the further back you go, there's more uncertainty. One, how many hurricanes were there because we didn't have satellites, the satellites were low resolution. As you go further back, we had no satellites, we just had ships. And then if it wasn't in shipping lanes or was short lived, we probably missed it. And so as you go back in time, both the hurricane data gets less certain as well as just the observations of what the water temperatures and pressures look like. We just didn't have as many of those. So one of the kind of the questions we're always asking ourselves is, do we build the models on more years of data that are less reliable, or do we build a model on fewer years of data that are more reliable, but then you just have fewer realizations of the atmosphere ocean kind of system? So, when it comes to, this is the biggest on record or the strongest on record, I was pretty careful to stipulate when the records began and kind of when we have more confidence in the records. There's certain places where, you can go back a couple hundred years and probably you can know if, say, a hurricane hit, a major city up the east coast of the US where it was pretty
Hmm.
densely populated. Whereas Florida, you go back to the late 19th century, there were parts of the state that had very few people. So if a hurricane hit, somebody knew it was there, but how strong it was is going to
Yeah.
become less and less clear. So it gets hard to go as you go back in time. So try to always kind of stipulate when talking about record setting that records only go back so far. And there is a lot of work being done with like using paleo records, so trying to look at like sediment depositions and stuff to try to estimate some of
Wow.
these historical hurricanes of the past, like before we had records. But
Hmm.
there's uncertainty associated with that, and even then, it's hard to know exactly how strong those storms were. But you know, obviously, when you're looking at records, they are they're not super long. So obviously, in reference to the age of the Earth, it's just a little bit of time.
Exactly, exactly. And so just to kind of recap a couple things for all of you tuning in, ensembles, when we use something like that, which is why, Phil, I'd wanted to bring that up as well, the difference between using just the ensemble suite versus the average. If you all recall, if you've been following News 6 or any weather source for a while now, we love to lean on ensembles, particularly for the hurricane season. It's the spaghetti lines, all the different little things that go across your screen. Usually there's a thicker line or something that stands out, which is the average. And remember, ensembles, it's kind of like you put everybody in a conference room. The director, the CEO, the boss gives you a idea, and he or she wants to know what your answer to that idea would be. And it's either I say this, I say that, I forecast this, I would forecast that. And then the average would be the average group that CSU and Phil were using for these preseasonal outlooks. Now we're going to take the whole focus group and kind of present it to everybody, which I think is really going to benefit us from the broadcast perspective, communicating to the audience, especially when, like you were mentioning, we have the folks who are like, they say this every year, or they always forecast high number of storms. We can start to kind of break down and almost cover down you guys from the front lines and let folks know, but this is the spread on it. So obviously there is still some room for error. There's a margin of error. So the key takeaway is X, Y, and Z, which I think is fabulous for just getting the message across. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Yes. And to get at the point about I've seen that posted where like people say, oh, they forecast high every year. If you look at our forecast back to 84 and add up the number of hurricanes we have predicted versus the number observed since 84, it's almost dead on the number, maybe like one or two high or one or two low, depending on the forecast. So we had some massive busts, but overall, we don't have a high or low bias. Like the general, people say, oh, you forecast high every year. Well, no, maybe the last few years we have, but the last few years have been busy. So we want to be forecasting high because they've been busy seasons. But in general, if you look back at time, there's been years where we forecast a lot and haven't gotten very many. And there's been years where we forecast few and we've gotten a lot. But overall, the forecasts do show skill, and the number of storms that we forecast versus observed is very, very close. So there's no long-term high or low bias in the forecast. And that's something we obviously are very careful of. We're not, tweaking the numbers or anything. It's just, it is what it is coming out of the models.
It is, exactly. And it's still an incredible feat what your team and all the other preseasonal folks do year to year. A lot of folks will give us broadcasters flack for trying to forecast the high temperature, like you said, 3 to 5 days out, let alone trying to forecast a full-fledged 6-month season from X amount of months in advance. So big kudos to you all. That's why I'm so fascinated by tropical meteorology and all the science, both big and small scale, that go into it. It's incredible, truthfully.
Yeah, and so when you think about it, so when it comes to like weather prediction, we know weather prediction after about 7 to 10 days really starts to go downhill. And kind of what we're forecasting is with seasonal hurricane forecast, we're really not forecasting hurricanes at all. What we're forecasting is basically the large scale environment. So in this case, we're talking about what is the shear going to look like in the Atlantic? What are the temperatures going to look like? And then for that set of conditions, in general, if the waters are warm, the shear is low, there's plenty of moisture, you're going to get a lot of storms, and they're probably going to be fairly strong. Now, there is uncertainty associated with that same set of conditions over that period. You can get, maybe fewer storms, but stronger. Say like last year, we had 18 storms, but 11 hurricanes. You can get other years where maybe there's more storms, but maybe not as many hurricanes. And so there will be maybe some slight variations on what a specific set of atmospheric conditions will give you, because at the end of the day, we are forecasting weather events, and you can have a very large area of conducive conditions, but maybe the storm finds out one little pocket where the conditions are not conducive, or vice versa. Storms interact with other storms, they miss land, they track over land, all these little things come into it. So when it comes to seasonal forecasts, we're never going to have perfect forecasts. I think if we can explain 50 to 60% of the variability from average, that's about probably as good as seasonal forecasts are going to do, just because, again, you are forecasting weather events on climate timescales. But yeah, if you think about it, it's pretty remarkable that you can say anything about a hurricane season 3-6 months in advance, because, but tropical weather is nice for forecasting because it tends to have a lot more persistence. So if the waters are hot today, they're probably going to be hot next week, probably hot 2 weeks from now. And that tends to, you don't get as many mid-latitude interactions as say you do in Colorado or even in Florida. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot more kind of persistence, which allows us to have the skill at forecasting tropical weather. If you try seasonal forecasting of mid-latitude weather, there's a little bit of skill in that, but that becomes a much harder process because the tropics will impact mid-latitude weather, but then there's other things that come in that can cause very different relationships. So, people say, okay, it's, this past winter is La Nina, therefore we're going to have this is how the atmospheric circulation is gone, and it matches up somewhat perfect match.
I see. Okay. We had a little bit of a latency there, but you're back now. We're all good now. I
saw that. Yeah. I watched myself talk like on a 10-second delay.
I'm not too sure what that was. Nothing else was happening on my side. Hopefully that was just a little bit of a hiccup right there. But talking overall perspective, one thing I want to note and I want to emphasize to viewers out there is the way Phil described the preseasonal forecast is fantastic, almost even eye-opening for me. They're not necessarily predicting the tropical cyclones themselves. And this kind of goes back to a few conversations we've had in video segments, in broadcast, or even in the digital streams when we talk analogs. Because, Phil, let me tell you, the bane of our existence is when a weather enthusiast or somebody with a phone or a camera and a mic, they get a hand on hyperactive or analog, and unfortunately, they kind of garble the message and the meaning behind it. And I think the way you explained that the preseason forecast is to describe the large scale, why it is. It could be a busy season and why it may not, why it could be impactful, why it might not. Whereas folks, I think, get too hung up on the numbers. Oh, they forecasted 20 named storms. We had 15. They don't know what they're doing. It's like, well, there's a lot that goes into it. So I definitely want to hammer that home for everybody out there. And that leads me perfectly into the next question. Do you guys have any thoughts or lessons learned from the 24 hurricane season? Because there were a lot of abnormalities during August and September, especially.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, so the 2024 season, at the end of the day, the numbers from our forecast were pretty good, especially for hurricanes and major hurricanes.
Yes.
We forecast number of storms and generally forecast 23 and we got 18. So we were way too high on those. And one of the challenges that you have with the seasonal forecast is, so to get a hurricane or a major hurricane, a category 3 or above, winds of 111 miles per hour or greater, you have to have a pretty large area of conducive conditions. To get weak storms, they don't need to be a very large area. So the number of storms we forecast, but that's a harder number to get. For example, you can have a year like 2004 where you have 15 storms, but you overall have an integrated metric like accumulated cyclone energy that takes into account the wind speed overall generated by storms throughout the season, which is very similar to 2005, but 2005 had 28 storms. So whether you have fewer storms, but they're really long-lived and intense, or more storms that are shorter lived and maybe not as strong and just a few intense ones, like it's hard to, there's a lot, that's why we forecast a pile of different metrics when it comes to our seasonal forecasts. But certainly 2024 was it was a hyperactive season based on NOAA's definition, but it was very, very odd. Obviously got off to a super busy start. We had the earliest category 5 hurricane on record with Hurricane Beryl, and everyone thought this is going to be the biggest season on record. I certainly thought we were going to be pushing up against 05 or 1933, some of the busiest seasons we've had. But what ended up happening was we went through this really prolonged lull during the climatological or average peak of the season from about August 20th to September 23rd. We basically had 5 weeks where we had the fewest, basically the lowest ACE, so that integrated wind metric, since 1994, which was 40 plus years ago. In 1994, the Atlantic was really cold. Last year it was near record warm. And so there was a lot of discussion about the lull. I did a ton of interviews about what the heck's going on. And even when I was doing interviews, especially as we got middle of September, it's like, okay, yes, it's very quiet now, but there could be a whole lot of bad stuff coming very, very soon. And obviously we went from having an extreme lull to having basically the busiest end of the Atlantic hurricane season on record for number of hurricanes. We had 7 hurricanes from September 25th onward. So last year, to put it in like baseball analogy, is going like 0 for 30 and then following it up with like 4 grand slams in a game or something. Like it just went from nothing to extremely busy. And so right now we're currently working on a journal article on the lull and what were the drivers of that really prolonged quiet period. And I think one of the challenges is that it was multiple factors. It wasn't like, oh, this one thing happened and therefore the season was quiet or that period was quiet. There were likely a few different factors. And so we discussed some of those in real time, but we're trying to basically get at it and try to quantify exactly what went wrong when. And so early during the lull, it seemed like some of the waves coming off Africa, so these strong thunderstorm complexes coming off of Africa, came off very far north. So instead of coming off around the latitudes of, say, Dakar, Senegal, like 15, 16, 17 north, they were coming about 5 degrees further north. Northern Mauritania, Western Sahara. People hear Sahara, they say dust, dry air, colder water. So those systems just didn't have a chance. But then those waves came back further south. And I think that's something I wanted to kind of clarify, is that initially when the lull happened, reporters started asking questions. And I said, well, right now the waves are too far north. And so it became this thing, well, the waves were too far north the whole time. And that really wasn't the case. It was just kind of a brief deviation. But then as we got later into August and early September, we had a pronounced intrusion of dry air that came in from the middle latitudes in early September. And then we had some subseasonal variability, what we call the Madden-Julian oscillation, which is basically tropical thunderstorm activity that oscillates around the globe about every 30 to 70 days, became somewhat unfavorable for hurricanes for about 2 to 3 weeks. But then as we got later in September, the Madden-Julian oscillation became more hurricane favorable. We had the waves move further south. The dust and dry air was kind of mitigated. And so we went from being basically extremely quiet to being hyperactive in a hurricane.
Yeah. No, I do remember that quite often, especially when it came to the media and especially the social media, when one thing kind of stirred the pot across the Atlantic basin, it was always that one piece: the dry air, the wave breaking, or the sinking air, no MJO, being too high up on the latitude with the ITCZ coming off of Africa. But I agree with you. It seemed like it was a conglomerate of things that you really couldn't see coming from an intra-seasonal standpoint, especially when building a preseason forecast. Is that something that you guys at CSU are going to try to maybe build some history, some data on, to develop maybe a rule of thumb, or a what's the word I'm looking for? I guess you could say a like kind of extrapolate that out. Like, this configuration, oceanic wise, hemispheric, the jet stream pattern, this could result in an amplified X or Y, resulting in the wave breaking or a shift north in our tropical convergence zone. Is that something that you'll be delving into?
Yeah, and so I don't think there's a lot we can say maybe with our April, June, or even our July updates, but I think with the
Hmm.
early August update, there's probably something we can say. And so one of the things that we saw last year was, so we had record warm waters or near record warm, depending exactly where you look. The shear was very
Hmm.
low, was forecast to be low, and normally that leads to extremely busy seasons. And normally that also is associated with years where you don't have very much dust. But in June, July, and early August, we had a lot of dust in the tropical Atlantic. So that kind of went opposite the normal relationship. But when you have a lot of dust, that can kind of basically kind of activate the easterly waves to come off a bit or further to the north. So I think that's something we're going to be looking at in the future. Maybe not necessarily implicitly putting dust in the model, but looking at the dust and being basically like, if everything else looks super conducive, but the dust is also extremely high, knock
Hmm.
down the forecast somewhat. So I think that's something that we're going to be taking a look at more closely, and we'll try to do some more quantification of that for the 2025 season, kind of using some of that data to see, how historically, how well would that help or hurt the model going forward?
I
But
see.
one of the things that was interesting about last year is a lot of our seasonal forecast skill comes from basically the relationship between shear and hurricane activity. In general, when shear is low, you get more storms, you get longer lived storms. And so last year, that relationship just didn't hold up super well. We had the lowest shear on record, and we were well above normal. But if you just say, like, historically, how much activity should we have had compared with what we ended up with, we should have had based on that historical relationship, like 20 to 30% more activity. So
Right.
there's again, these are weather events that we're trying to forecast on climate timescale. So there is going to be kind of some of that uncertainty that goes into it. So certainly we'll be trying to improve, the forecast going forward. But given that the season overall still ended up hyperactive, and overall our
Yeah.
numbers of hurricanes and major hurricanes were pretty much right on, it's a very different, it's looking back at it now, it's very different than say how we've been talking, mid-September last year when we thought we may have, the biggest seasonal forecast bust on record.
I see what you're saying. And it's funny you mentioned that too, that there's only so much that you can forecast with that intra-season variability. Will a trough be there? Will there be a pocket of wind shear? Will there be a plume of dry, dusty air coming off of Africa? I wanted to know your thoughts on the evolution of the seasons, because I know 2022 was another one where I believe you all forecasted just, an above average season. It could be kind of busy. 2023, we rolled into it with what was supposed to be a strong Nino. And as a result, we were thinking average, maybe even below average, and that one exploded despite being in a almost, some would say, a super Nino out there in the Pacific equatorial. And then we have 2024 to where it almost seemed like we had the planetary atmospheric alignment for another '05, 2020, 33, but then we ended up with something on par with almost like a 2022, or I would say even very reminiscent of '04.
Yeah, I mean, and so, each season presents its own challenges. So 2022 was a very unusual season in that, we ended up with an average-ish season, but it came late. So August we had
Hmm.
no storms, zero, the entire month of August, and there was a lot that year. There was a lot of mid-latitude interactions during August. We had a lot of kind of interactions. So when you get the mid-latitudes kind of digging into the tropics, you get these kind of what we call these troughs high up in the atmosphere. So low pressures high up in the atmosphere that can bring a lot of dust and especially dry air from the mid latitudes, and also really increase the shear.
Hmm.
And so that really held down the season through August, and then September came along and things got busy in a hurry, most notably because of Fiona and Hurricane Ian, that I'm
Ian,
sure
yep.
most people in Florida are unfortunately very familiar with. 2023 was an interesting case, and 2023 I think was a year where these dynamical models really help. So historically, the adage was if you have a strong El Nino, will kind of dominate over anything else. And so that's kind of our historical kind of analog. But when we looked at the climate model predictions, the climate models were forecasting a strong El Nino. They were forecasting a record warm Atlantic, and they forecast low shear. And so we went with, okay, we do expect an above normal season despite the strong El Nino, which again, goes against what Bill Gray would have said for many, many years. But the dynamical models were right. We had low shear, and we ended up with a very busy season. Thankfully, most of that stuff was in the East Atlantic, so not a ton of impacts except for Hurricane Idalia was the most impactful storm. And then last year, it kind of looked like all systems were go for, a 2005. And again, 11 hurricanes, 5 major hurricanes, hyperactive. It was a very busy season, but given kind of what we were expecting it to be, it certainly wasn't, I think up to the levels that we thought, especially for kind of the number of storms and that accumulated cyclone energy. We didn't get a lot of storms coming off Africa until late. Most of the stuff was in the Western Atlantic, which obviously caused significant impacts. But if you look at a storm like Helene or Milton, they were fairly short-lived, so they were very impactful. But that ACE or integrated metric requires storm duration, and those storms were just not out there for very long. So while they were strong and powerful, they just didn't last very long. So they didn't generate out those aggregate statistics like we thought we expected to see more long-lived storms coming off Africa, like a Hurricane Beryl, that we saw coming off Africa in late June.
Which is very weird. It's almost like it flipped. You expect things to start to manifest in the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America. You almost got me there. And the Caribbean Sea early and then very late in the season. And then we go to long track or Cabo Verde season, as they call it, between August and October. But it almost flipped. We had Beryl and fairly healthy waves during late June into July. And then we turned off, which was very bizarre. And it almost looks like...
It was almost like you almost took the season and flipped it on its head last year, where we had a very busy early and a very busy late season. And late season, we actually had systems coming off Africa. We had Kirk and Leslie in October right off of Africa, which is extremely unusual. Before this October, we hadn't had a storm basically form a hurricane east of the islands in the tropics in October. And so Kirk broke the old record by like 1,000 miles. And then Leslie broke that record by a couple hundred more. So, it was impressive to see basically how dead the season was, and then to flip and starting to see in October stuff more we would expect to see in late August, early September. So it was a very, at the end of the day, you just showed me the numbers at the end of the season and I hadn't paid any attention all year, you'd say, okay, those numbers were fairly close to what we thought, but how it got there was extremely unusual.
Right. I see what you're saying. Do you think that the record warmth waters that we've been seeing in both basins, the Pacific and especially the Atlantic Nino kind of kicking in more so in the northern hemispheric side, do you think, especially for 2023, have you all kind of speculated that maybe the heat is what helped to reduce that changing in the El Nino induced wind shear coming into our basin? It kind of put a halt to it?
That's correct. Yeah. So if you look at, we did a paper on last year or the 2023 hurricane season. And for that paper, we looked at it from an observational perspective and said, okay, the shear was lower. And then we ran some model simulations where we basically said, okay, if you turn off the Atlantic warming, how would the shear have responded? And if the Atlantic had been average, you would have had a lot more shear and probably a quiet season.
Wow.
But we looked at the Atlantic and said, okay, because the Atlantic was so hot, you didn't get the same atmospheric response that you normally get in an El Nino. Because basically, if you warm the Atlantic 2 degrees, you warm the Pacific 1 degree, generally the Atlantic in that situation, quote unquote, wins in terms of where your strong thunderstorms are going to form. So we focus on the Atlantic, but also the Indian Ocean has been extremely warm in recent years, warming at a faster rate than the other oceans. And that definitely plays a role as well. Yeah.
I see. Okay. It almost makes you wonder if the waters stay as warm as they are, they just continue to either consistently warm, on average, we'll say hypothetically 1/8 or 1/10 of a degree annually. And that's actually a question I had saved, for the back end of our discussion, but I'll go ahead and let her rip now. Would you say that these preseason forecasts, not only because we're accumulating more data, will evolve, but do you think that the changes on a global scale, whether it be teleconnections, oscillations, the way the jet responds to the warmth of the oceans across the globe, whether it be north or southern hemispheric related, Would you say that it's more or less going to be something you have to stay on your toes with producing these preseason forecasts? They'll always be changing the way you bring them together?
Yeah, that's correct. So our seasonal forecasts have changed with time, and they will continue to change with time, whether it be due to natural modes of variability, due to long-term climate change warming. All these different things do matter. And so we'll find there's periods, if you look back historically, there's periods where, relationship between El Nino and Atlantic hurricanes has been stronger or weaker than it is now. And there may be other periods. It's so basically Bill Gray used to always say the entire atmosphere ocean functions as a single unit, and that's
Hmm.
true. And so, if say everything's a 1 degree warmer, that may change, basically just change how things operate. So it is important to kind of, always be looking at these forecasts, always be, not that you change them every year, but that you're always kind of looking for new predictors.
Yeah.
If some predictors maybe aren't working as well, you may want to use something else. Because again, if you look back historically, predictors have been stronger or weaker than they are with hurricanes today. And that's just because, what hurricanes respond to today may be slightly different from what they responded to in the past. If the waters are warmer, maybe shear matters more, maybe it matters less. Like, it's just hard to know exactly how all this plays out. So certainly, both with natural climate variability and all these climate modes changing on natural timescales, as well as any sort of climate change warming modulations, all this does matter in terms of seasonal forecasts.
Wow, it really gives us a lot to ponder on, not only together, but as an audience as well, listening to the data and the information that you all not only research, but put out for us to chomp on and then communicate to our viewers. This honestly excites me to get back into tropical meteorology that much more for the 2025 season. And now that, since I bring it up, have you all done any look-sees at what this upcoming season looks like? Because I personally, I'd like to do certain little, month to month fun conversations via live stream on my own social media. And it does seem like a lot of our climate models are thinking another big flip, a big change in comparison to what we saw last year versus what could take place this upcoming season.
Yeah, so we're always looking ahead. I mean, admittedly, I'll be starting to look at the following season by September and October of the previous season.
I'm also guilty.
And so, yeah, I mean, so our first forecast will come out on Thursday, April 3rd. And there's still a lot that can change. A lot will change during the winter into the spring months. So right now we have a weak La Nina in place.
Hmm.
And so there's a lot of question, will that persist? Will it weaken? Will it go to El Nino? There's just a lot of uncertainty with that. NOAA will put out their next probabilistic outlook. See, today's the 11th. It'll be on Thursday, the 13th. So they'll
Oh,
have an
okay.
update then, kind of their thoughts on things. The January update, which came out, it's a little bit old now because it came out about a month ago. They gave a 21% chance of El Nino for August through October, which are historically the peak 3 months of the season. So
Hmm.
we'll see how that changes. There's just a lot of uncertainty we call it, unfortunately, El Nino, La Nina has what they call a springtime predictability barrier, which really stinks for us trying to do seasonal forecasts that have to look through that. And that's because typically if El Nino is going to change to La Nina or vice versa, it'll do so during the spring months. And kind of the winds that drive a lot of the El Nino, La Nina variability tend to be weaker. So kind of small changes in the atmospheric circulation can make big differences in how, whether you go to El Nino, whether you stay at La Nina, whether you just kind of end up in neutral territory. I would say at this point, the odds of El Nino look relatively low.
Hmm.
Um, so if we don't have El Nino, right now the Atlantic is also extremely warm, not as warm as last year at this time, which is good. There have been some fairly strong winds blowing across the tropical Atlantic, which have caused a lot of evaporation and some mixing that's helped cool stuff down. But at some point, those winds look like they're probably going to weaken back down in a couple of 3 weeks. So we'll see kind of where we are towards the end of March. But right now, stuff is still running, much warmer than normal. So again, it kind of remains to be seen, say by end of March, are we trending away from La Nina, moving closer to El Nino, or are things looking like we're going to stay either neutral or La Nina? And then also, what the Atlantic configurations are looking like in terms of water temperatures. Is it still well above normal at the end of March? It means a lot more if it's well above normal at the end of March than say in the middle of February. So there's still kind of
Right.
a lot of monitoring. There's just a lot of uncertainty this time of year, which is one of the reasons why we don't issue our first forecast
Hmm.
until early April.
Copy that. That makes sense. So before we start slowly closing out the discussion, folks, just want to kind of rein everything in because we've talked a lot about ENSO, we've talked a lot about teleconnections, we've talked a lot about configurations. Just to put it all together, weather is in essence all encompassing. When I say put it together, you literally put it together. What happens in one part of the globe will inevitably impact, believe it or not, what happens here in Central Florida. What happens in the Indian Ocean, as Phil mentioned, will have implications on, for example, Enzo, or for example, what the Atlantic does. There's a huge connection on a global scale with the weather. So if you all are listening to some of our live discussions and we're talking about what's happening in Canada or the Northern Pacific, there's a reason for it. It's coming down the pike. You just got to give it a chance to do so. And so, Phil, I have just two more questions for you, okay? First and foremost, with these preseason forecasts, what would you, in your both personal and professional opinion, say would be the key takeaway for someone in my role in a digital platform, or say the rest of my team on TV? When we receive the preseason package, is what I'll call it, what would you say we should pull from it and really communicate to our viewers to better prepare them for the season?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously with the seasonal forecast, there's uncertainty in the forecast. It's important to convey that. It's also important to convey that, this is for the Atlantic as a whole. We're not seeing, that a storm's going to make a specific landfall in a specific area.
Hmm.
But it's also important to realize, because I feel like sometimes, it's always important to say it just takes one, but I think it's also important to convey that in general, more active seasons do have more landfalls. You can get really unlucky like 92 and have one major hurricane and have it be Andrew, or you can get very lucky like 2010 and have 12 hurricanes and not one hit the US. But in general, busier seasons are going to have more landfalling storms. So I think it's important to convey that, it's not, I've heard, I feel like sometimes you will hear people that basically make it sound like whether we get 4 hurricanes or 12, the odds of a landfall are the same. And that's not true. Like in
Hmm.
general, just think of it as throwing darts at a board. If you throw enough darts at a board, you're probably going to get a bullseye if you have no idea what you're doing.
Exactly.
And so, again, you can get lucky, but the odds, basically what we're doing is we're looking at odds and looking at that kind of stuff. So in general, busier seasons are going to have more landfalls, but it's important to realize also, in a year, most years, regardless of how busy it is, even regardless of a lot of landfalls, most areas are not going to experience much, if any, impacts.
Hmm.
But, there's going to be, as you expand the region that you're forecasting for, the odds of impacts would also increase. So we, in addition to forecasting basin-wide storms, now actually forecast accumulated cyclone energy, which again is that wind energy metric in the western half of the basin. So basically from 60 degrees west longitude, so that's basically like near the Leeward and Windward Islands, anything west of that.
Hmm.
And so the reason why we forecast that is because east of the islands, there's not much in the way of impacts in terms of to people, life, and property. But the western half of the basin, that's where people live, that's where property is. And so we were trying to kind of highlight, for example, 2023, we said likely a busy season, but probably a little less of that ACE in the western half of the basin, which actually worked out quite well. Whereas last year we said with La Nina tends to favor low shear in the Caribbean, tends to favor late season storms, which are more likely to cause impacts. And so if we look at the forecast from last year, we said a busy season and probably also relative to basin wide, even more activity in the western half of the basin, which is what we saw. So there are some things that we're working at to try to kind of, trying to kind of break it a little more to impacts. But again, on a seasonal time scale, we can forecast overall basin-wide storm activity, maybe a little bit of where storms are likely to form. But
Right.
forecasting exactly how they're going to track is governed by mid-latitude weather, which is forecast a few days, a week in advance. And obviously we see even with an individual storm, there's, as you talked about earlier with the ensemble forecast, like there's spread in that ensemble. And,
Yes.
exactly where that storm goes. We look at Hurricane Milton last year. Obviously, Milton brought a tremendous amount of rain to Tampa Bay, but a day or two before it was like, is this going to be a 10, 12-foot storm surge in Tampa Bay?
Yeah,
It
exactly.
wasn't, but it was very, very close. And it was just a subtle little jog to the south that made a huge difference in the storm surge impacts for Tampa Bay.
That's what I think is my favorite part about tropical forecasting. Not only what gets these things going, but all the finite details that you constantly need to stay on top of every step of the way. Because some folks, they'll be lulled into a false sense of security. We can see it literally coming from 1,000 miles away. But at the end of the day, with all the different moving pieces from a large scale to the small scale, anything can change. And that's why, like you'd mentioned throughout the discussion, that there always is that error, and you want to make sure that you're consistently on top of your stuff. And then finally, to bring it all in to close out, because I know we've been going on this live stream for pushing an hour. Somehow my live streams always run an hour. What advice would you give up and coming meteorologists or student meteorologists for, when they want to dabble into studying a niche like tropical meteorology or even mid latitude winter storms or, just anything in the science of weather? What's some good advice that you'd pass along to them since you've been in it for a while?
Yeah, I mean, I always feel, especially with meteorology, I think a lot of people, it's one or two events that kind of catalyze why you get interested in weather. And so I feel like most people, one of my friends says that it's like most people have like a good origin story when it comes to weather. It was either a
Yeah.
hurricane, a tornado, a major snowstorm. For me, it was major snowstorms and hurricanes that really got me interested in weather. And so it's kind of a cool. So I think really the key is like following what you really want to do. I mean, there's a ton of. So when I got in the field, we didn't, the internet was just coming online. And so how old I am. So there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of amazing resources online that you can use. I mean, look for doing internships at a local weather service office, things like that's a great way to get into interning at local TV stations, all this stuff. I mean, really there are a ton of really good tropical resources out there. I'm sure a lot of viewers are probably familiar with Tropical Tidbits, is one of my favorite websites.
Yes.
There's a few other good ones like Cyclonic Weather. Obviously, the Hurricane Center is the gold standard for everything from the forecast from the National Hurricane Center. Their discussions are always a fascinating read. And yeah, there's just a tremendous amount of research that's currently ongoing. I think if you're a young up and coming scientist, is it's the thing I always say, the cool thing about meteorology is it's a very young field, and that really didn't get started till right after World War II. So when you go into meteorology, you can be looking at questions that nobody has answered yet very quickly. It takes a lot longer,
Wow.
say, a more classical science like physics or chemistry, I think, to get to the forefront than it does in meteorology because it is such a young field. And I tell students coming into our research group that are master students, I'm like, you're probably researching something no one really has looked at before, which is really cool.
Wow.
So
It
there are still a
is.
lot of questions that we don't have answers to. And so I think over my career, I've answered some questions, but I probably have a lot more questions now in my head than I did when I started.
I
And
feel that for sure.
every year raises more questions.
Oh yeah, it always will. That's my favorite part about the weather as well, is it keeps you on a learning curve. You're never going to know everything. And with the things rapidly
Correct.
evolving on a climate scale and just on a localized weather, under the microscope, your own local area, I feel like you're never going to see the same exact thing happen twice, let alone three times. So I think that's what the pleasure of studying meteorology. You'll always be studying.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. And it has a very good way of keeping you humble.
Humble, yes, that's the big one. So for all you out there watching, who especially if you follow other forecasters, both professionally or the influencers and the enthusiasts, let them know every once in a while to take it down a couple notches because Mother Nature always has something up her sleeve she's going to throw at us. But Phil, thank you so
Exactly.
much for
Yes.
your time. It's been an absolute joy. I think it's safe to assume that you're going to be at the Hurricane Conference this year, yes, in New Orleans.
Yes, I will be at the National Hurricane Conference in New Orleans. Will you be there?
That's the goal. Yes, I'm actually working behind the
All
scenes
right.
now to either figure out if KMG is going to foot the bill to get me out there or if I'm just going to come out of pocket and say, to heck with it, let's get in there.
All right. Cool. Well, definitely hit me up. We'll go hang out there.
For sure. That'd be great. That'd be great. Alrighty, everybody. So thank you so much for tuning in today. This has been the Digital Weather Center, a spectacular conversation. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, drop them in the comments section down below upon the conclusion of this live stream. If you're over on News 6 Plus, thank you so much for sticking with us for the long haul. It's been outstanding having you join us this Tuesday morning. It's still the morning. This would be when we'd be rolling into our weather brief, but I'm going to get working behind the scenes and bid Phil a fond farewell once we conclude the live stream. I hope you've all had a spectacular start to your week, and I hope you have a great rest of the week ahead. We got a lot of stuff happening out there in the weather world, so best believe I will be back on camera here very soon to talk all about it. But until then, you know the drill. This is the Digital Weather Center, signing out.